Oh hi, it's you lot again. Guess that means it's time for this week's video. Imagination. Have you ever imagined that maybe your coffee could be tea? Wouldn't that be a crazy thought? Wouldn't that be a mildly amusing idea? What else can you imagine? You can imagine
that your car is a chair, or you can imagine that your chair is a car. You can imagine that letters are numbers. You can imagine that feet are hands. You can imagine that your ears smell and your nose hears. You can imagine that you're a real person and not just a character in an internet video. You can imagine that a stubbed toe is leprosy. You can imagine that licorice is edible. You can imagine that licorice is easy to spell.
You can imagine that your parents are proud of you.
You can imagine that communism is a good idea. You can imagine that gates are well-behaved members of society.
You can imagine the end of this video.
You can imagine a duck with very long legs. You can imagine that spilt milk is leprosy. You can imagine that Locrian is a stable mode to compose a song in. You can imagine hair. You can imagine hair. In your soup, you can imagine that aeroplanes in the night sky are shooting stars. You can imagine that a rock could be a pet. You can imagine that quitchy is pronounced quiche. You can imagine that bread and water are a full meal. You can imagine that a good punchline could be leprosy. You can imagine that a picture is as good as the real thing.
You can imagine that this ending is not an anticlimax.